Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of deep dives into classic poems. Today's episode revolves around The Lake Isle of Innisfree by W.B. Yeats and the study of this poem. Now, for the Irish students watching this comes up in your junior cycle as part of your collection of texts, and if you're watching this later on as a Leaving Cert student, this will be seen as part of a broader study of the poetry of Yeats. So, for that, what we're going to be looking at is the regular issues like themes, tones, imagery, poetic techniques, all those things that you see with every poem. Also, we're going to look at a breakdown line for line, hence why we're doing this deep dive, and a bit on Yeats himself. Okay, an interesting, huge, overwhelming literary figure, not just Irish history, but the history of the English literature, and how his personal beliefs and his personal experiences shaped his poetry to give us a broader understanding of this. So we're starting here with the great man Yeats himself. Yeats lived from 1865 until 1939. He, as we said earlier, was an Irish poet, and he was probably one of the biggest figures and the most prominent figures of 20th century literature. He was part of the Irish literary establishment. He helped found the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which was important culturally, and politically he was relevant because he was a senator of the Irish Free State after independence in Britain. Now, he was born in Sandymount in Dublin in Ireland, and he was educated there and also in London. So we see this, how it affects his writing. And especially for today's deep dive and today's lesson, he spent his holidays as a child in County Sligo, and he studied this poetry from an early age. And because he studied from this early age, he became fascinated with Irish culture and Irish legends and the idea of the occult and the afterlife and black magic. So this is common, and it's the themes that run throughout his work. So, as well as being obsessed with the physical and the spiritual, he's also obsessed with the cultural. And you'll see elements of all three in this poem today. And in 1923, he was awarded as well the Nobel Prize in Literature. So we're going to have a look at this poem. Now, what about Innisfree itself? So the Lake Isle is what we see here in the middle of this picture. So the Lake Isle itself is in County Sligo. Hence the childhood photos and the childhood, I suppose, obsession with it that comes from that. But it's an uninhabited island on what's called Lough Gill in County Sligo. And Yeats spent his summers in Sligo, as we said already, as a child. So Yeats tells us the inspiration for the poem came from a sudden memory of his childhood while he was walking down Fleet Street in London around the year 1888. And the reason we know this is because Yeats says it himself in his own autobiography. He recalls that when walking through Fleet Street, very homesick, I heard a little tinkle of water and saw a fountain in a shop window which balanced a little ball upon its jet, and began to remember the lake water. From the sudden remembrance came my poem Innisfree, my first lyric with anything in its rhythm of my own music. So, this comes from looking at the toy shop, looking at this fountain, this little tinkle of water, and it reminds him of Innisfree. So he talks about his lyrics. So, a couple of years later, he writes it, and it's Arise and Go. And that becomes kind of the most memorable line, the rallying cry from it. I will arise and go now. That first lyric that Yeats talked about is what becomes so important. Now, what we also have here is, before we look at the poem, before we read it, we have to ask ourselves these questions. How is it structured? What kind of language and poetry techniques are used? And are there any more metaphors or hidden meanings behind it? Now, before we go into this as well as the daydreaming, we realise here that Yeats was also inspired by other writers. And he was inspired by the novel Walden, by a writer called Henry David Thoreau. And so he wanted to get back to nature. And his best example of nature and isolation, and the first thing that came to his mind, was Innisfree and Sligo. So, we'll read it together and then we'll analyse it. And stanza 1. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows I will have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning to where the cricket sings. There, midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and the evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day. I hear late water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey. I hear it in the deep heart's core. Now, so looking at this poem and going through it line by line and stanza by stanza, a couple of things we need to recognise here. So, it's again another 12-line poem. It's a key point here. And it's divided into 3 quartiles. So as we've seen in previous videos, a quartile or a quatrain are 4-line stanzas. And it's a good example of Yeats' earlier, his lyric poems that he would have used a lot. Now, as well as that, we're looking at the themes here. So the main theme in this poem is about the harmony between man and nature. Something, again, that's in sharp contrast to Yeats in Fleet Street, London. Or life in any major city for that account. And that's what makes Yeats' poetry so accessible. So even though we're using Fleet Street in the context of our analysis and for your answers that you'll be on about this, you could easily substitute London for any major city, or Fleet Street for any other city in the world. And just as simply, Innisfree doesn't have to be literally Innisfree. It's that place where you are, which makes you feel happiest and makes you feel most comfortable. So as well as the other themes, there's, I suppose, the poet's discontent, which leads him to imagine this perfect place. So as we know, Innisfree is uninhabited, people don't live there, but because it's unspoiled by man, that's what makes it perfect in Yeats' eyes. He's longing to go back to nature and a self-sufficient life, and a search for peace, wisdom and truth. So, the idea, our themes here, getting back to nature. We have our search for wisdom. Search for truth. And perhaps a rejection of modern life. So even though this poem was written in 1888, we're still looking at it as in you're talking about rejecting the hustle and bustle of city life and getting back to basics. Okay? As well as that, we know it's a quatrain. Okay? 12-line poem broken down into 3 quatrains. And we also see this AB rhyming scheme. And what I mean by AB is if we go here, how every second line rhymes. So night and day rhymes with pavements grey. So AA. And then the B here, low sounds by the shore, is done with deep heart's core. Go back to stanza 2. And we go again, AB, AB, slow rhymes with glow. And with the B here we have sings rhymes with linnet's wings. And just to show you, just for full disclosure, stanza 1, Innisfree and honeybee, and you have wattles made with the bee loud laid. So it's what we call that AB structure. Now, the last line of each stanza shortens the line, the sound. So it's just another interesting thing to look at. Now, as well as the theme and message, the speaker longs for that simple life, man and nature. And again, how do we back it up in the poem? Here's the line in line 12. And we'll keep referring to this line because when you're talking about your poem, this is the crucial line. He feels this so strongly, he feels it in his deep heart's core. So he feels it at his very innermost, basic human level. Think of heart, you think desire. And then you might pause this video and reread it in your notes in front of you, or if you have the lyrics, and be able to go through it yourself and see if there's anything different that you pick down from this. Now, when we've done that, we're looking at the oral and visual details. So again, what techniques are used here that we can see that makes the poem stand out? Or what does Yeats do to emphasise how he's feeling? So, unlike some of Yeats' later poems, his epic poems that would go on for a couple of lines and a couple of stanzas, this one's one of his relatively shorter ones. Okay, so there's not a lot of visual imagery because he's in the same place, but it shows ambition. Okay, so what we call here, this declarative statement, is the idea of showing ambition. Okay, and what we mean by that, we can see that he will do, he shall in line 1 and line 5. So it's all future tense. It's all declarative. It's all about showing this ambition. And as well as the ambition and the declarative statements, to really hammer it home is repetition. And this repetition is used for emphasis. To show how important it is. To make it stick out in the reader's mind. So that while it sticks out in our mind, we feel this desire. We feel what Yeats feels in his deep heart's core. Okay? W.B. Yeats had this vision of a romantic, idyllic, timeless way of life. And the poet imagines life in peace and solitude. And he sees that in Innisfree for himself. And again, we have metaphors. So the metaphor here, our example, peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning, in lines 5 and 6, the first two lines of the second quartile, in which the dropping of the mist in the sky is compared to the peace that overcomes the island, and the peace that overcomes, as a result, Yeats himself. Okay? He becomes so involved in this idea of paradise that the future tenses is abandoned in this metaphor. And this entire poem itself could be a metaphor in which Innisfree is his escape from reality. So there's two versions of the metaphor here. And again, alliteration. So we have classic poetic techniques here, like repetition, metaphor, and alliteration. So we hear just lapping low, so lapping, lake, water, lapping, low sounds. So you have that L, okay? Excuse the font making the small L look like a capital I, but it is the L sounds we're looking for here. And again, in line 3, a hive for the honeybee. So that repetition of the H sound. So the alliteration helps with the metaphor, but the alliteration also helps that emphasis, that repetition, that it has that A, B beat that allows you to stick out in the head and feel as he's doing. And then personification. So personification is to make something human, to humanize it. And what he does here is the cricket sings. The cricket is given human-like abilities, and the singing, happiness. Personification, happiness, that he's singing, that he's jumping for joy. And why does he have this joy? It's because he's on Innisfree. Imagery. So if you want to talk about imagery, how do you use it? Okay? What visual techniques are there? So it's all based around this island of Innisfree that we know is a real place. The use of imagery helps the diction of the poem, helps the wording, the phrasing of the poem. It again amplifies it. It helps provide this image of the piece. Okay, so here we go. The midnight's all a glamour, and the noon's a purple glow. So again, the idea of purple, this noon, so it's again times where you traditionally be relaxed. Okay, noon, midnight, that you're all winding down. A small cabin built there of clay and wattles. So it's again this back to basics idea. Compared to the large, huge architecture, the big concrete buildings that he'd be exposed to in London, or that you would see in a lot of big cities. An evening full of the linnet's wings. So it's just again talking in these last few lines that, everything is soft and slow. It creates a sense of peace and calm. And then diction, the wording. So as we said, we have the quatrain. Okay, or the quartile, whichever way you want to talk about it. The rhyming scheme here is A, B, A, B, or if you want to structure it in each stanza, it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. But again, every second line. So line 1 will rhyme 3 in the quatrain, and line 2 will always rhyme line 4 in the quatrain. Yeats tells us he's going to go to Innisfree, that he will arise and go there and build his cabin. It's this back to basics idea, this wanting to be a part of nature. And then just as we're buying into the dream, as we're, allowing ourselves to drift away and reflect on that perfect place or that Innisfree that we all have, he brings us back down to earth in those last 2 lines, which we'll look at in stanza 3 in our analysis a bit more. There's no conflict in the story. It's just talking about some guy's desires. Again, that daydream, that idea that there's always something out there for us. The idea that the grass might be greener on the other side. Like the other poems we've seen in this series so far as well. It's simple, accessible language. So Yeats isn't trying to be pretentious. Yeats isn't trying to be over the top. Yeats isn't using difficult imagery or difficult language just for the sake of it. And as you go on and study Yeats later on, you could argue he does in a lot of his other poems. But we just see this guy being himself and telling us about his deepest desire. That idea to return home. And we can see that it's his desires because of these words like peace, veil, glimmer, glow. Everything's nice, everything's shiny, everything, in other words, is this image of perfection. But these words then will contrast with the turning point that we have in the last 2 lines, which was gloomy and boring. So you're going from words like glimmer and glow, brightness, shininess, perfection, to the grey pavements. So between line 6 and line 11 here, you have basically the complete opposite. Now, and the speaker himself. So Yeats, we know, is doing this in the first person. So when we're talking about how the poet is feeling, there's no ambiguity. This is not a story, this is not fiction. As Yeats tells us in his autobiography, this is exactly how he felt at the time. So it's a first person account. Perhaps it's even a primary source if you're looking at it from a historical perspective. So even though the speaker isn't named in it, we know that it's Yeats. Okay? Regardless of whether you think it is or it isn't, he's a city dweller who wishes to live in Innisfree. So there's no ambiguity, there's really no confusion there. But again, if you replace it, the metaphors here, Innisfree is that your own perfect place that you can think of, where you're happy, where you're peaceful, where you're calm, where everything's okay. And Fleet Street, London, is that modern life that you live now, where you're busy, where you're working, where you don't have time to reflect. So he said it can be any city, any place. London and Innisfree, as well as being real places, can also be seen as metaphors. Hence our setting. While I stand by the roadway, or on the pavement's grey, I hear it into the deep park's core. So again, that's the turning point. We see this as how boring and uninspiring modern life can be. One of the biggest tragedies. Despite the title and the context of this poem the last two lines of this poem indicate that while dreams are good and dreams keep us sane and keep us human, unfortunately sometimes we have to be brought back to reality, and that we have to understand this reality check. And that's what it is. The speaker was simply dreaming of the island of Innisfree while on the streets. You could argue that dreams, while they might not always be achievable, dreams can be good for keeping one sane and giving you something to live for. Now, and there is action in the poem. So this poem, even though it's a very basic 12-line poem, it has everything in it. So the only other character we're talking about is the speaker. He wants to live alone. So, just self-isolation. Yeats wanted to do quarantine and lockdown before the coronavirus. He's the only speaker here, and the only people that keep him company, or the only organisms that keep him company, would be things like the crickets, the linnets, the honeybees. All examples of nature. And apart from the personification of the singing of the cricket in line 6, it's just Yeats himself. So, let's look back here at line 1 and stanza 1. So we have this, okay? I will arise and go now to Innisfree. So it's important that we have our quotes, that we're able to look at this, that we are able to see this as it is. That it begins and ends with living in a tree. Now, this is a commentary from Yeats on modern life. He has this drab existence, and this final line that we had in stanza 3 is this crucial statement. Okay? It's, for W.B. Yeats, it's sums up his career as a whole. It's that his deep heart's core is essential to life, that for all of us, our dreams, our wishes, our hopes are essential to keep us going. Okay? But, unfortunately, there is always going to be some bit of struggle. And that's the way we look at this poem. So there's uplifting bits, and you can, again, the beauty of poetry, because it's open to your own interpretation, and for someone like Yeats, who would have left it open-ended purposely, you can see it as an uplifting poem, you can see it as a depressing poem, you can see it as an uninspiring poem, you can see it as an inspiring poem. Okay? There's a lot of juxtapositions in this poem. And there's a lot of contradiction. So when you're explaining it, and when you're going through it, and when you're looking at it, you can go either way with it. You can talk about either one. It's totally 100% up to you. That's what makes Yeats both an interesting poem to write about and a poet that can frustrate you. But it's a good way, guys, to look at it. It will help you. If you understand this poem, you will understand all other types of poems. Okay? Its simple structure, it expresses his longing for peace and tranquility on Innisfree while being in an urban setting. He can escape the noise of the city and be lulled by this idea of the lake water lapping. Okay? He also returns to nature by growing beans, by having beehives. He enjoys the purple glow and the evening full of leather wings. The purple glow here is heather. So the plant heather. The sound of the linnet wings, and of course the bees. He can even build a cabin, and he can stay on his island as much as the earlier mentioned Thoreau we were talking about Walden did. Okay? During Yeats's lifetime, I suppose, the other thing that's crucial to note here, it was one of his most popular poems. And despite him, despite it being the poem that made him, he was also a poem that used to annoy him quite a lot because he didn't want to be seen for just having this one poem. Kind of like the singers today who hate it when people ask them just to play one song over and over again. But this first quatrain speaks to the needs of the man, the need for food and shelter. stanza 2 relates to the needs of your spirit, or the needs of the soul. So hence, the idea of peace. And then, stanza 3 is about reality. It's the idea of your memories, how he remembers Innisfree, how he remembers everything being perfect in his nostalgia, versus the idea of the modern world, or modern life, the here and now. The idea of those pavements grey. Okay. So, thank you for listening, guys. This is the latest in our series of Junior Surf videos about W.B. Yeats. There will be more to come. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe, and I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.